How are you, sir?
Doing great. How are you, Tony?
I am all right. I'm glad you were available and had the opportunity. This series that we're doing, talking to the gubernatorial candidates about what it is they see and how they envision Indiana going forward. I thought it was more important than just sometimes the smaller times you have on a radio to do it on radio, to do it here and then bring it to all the places. So let's start with you. Why are you doing this?
Well, Tony, I grew up in a small town. And when I grew up in the 70s and 80s in our small towns in Butler and Auburn, that was a time where we began to see the decline of the small towns. And we were told, hey, go to college, get a degree, and go get a job because that's your way out.
Right.
It was never the way back. And then when I was in law school, I met this guy that began to show us that we could turn communities around. And that really hooked me on the importance of state and local government in terms of how do you take communities that have sort of been forgotten or declining and turn them around.
Take me back to that. We talk a lot about brain drain in the state of Indiana. Here we are. We've got these incredible universities, and then nobody stays. But it's an interesting concept. We teach people how to get out. We don't teach people how to get back. Well, what does getting back mean to you?
Well, to me, when Macy and I got married in 1998, we were trying to decide with her job and my job. My job was in Auburn, her job was in downtown Fort Wayne. Where do we live? And so we kind of picked halfway in between, but we stuck with Fort Wayne because it was a little bigger city with a little more amenities. But now what we're starting to see in our smaller communities is the same amenities that we see in our big cities, but with a lot less hassle. How do we define hassle? Traffic. That's a hassle. We want our coffee shops, we want them to be unique.
Crime is a hassle.
Crime is a hassle. The cost of living is a hassle. So what we started to see as we restore our communities is our kids and grandkids moving back into our smaller towns and our regions.
There's always a conversation about entertainment, right? People move to cities because there's these chances, as Professor Elaine Berteau talks about it, as chance encounters, random encounters. Small cities, do you feel they do offer that in Indiana, or they can? And how do you attract the college educated or the educator or the professional, even if it wasn't college, which I think is very acceptable? How do you attract them back? What are the amenities you're referring to? And how does the state help the cities make that happen?
Well, a lot of the amenities are like what we're seeing. I'll speak of Fort Wayne because I know it so well. We have this beautiful riverfront, right, that we had ignored for 50, 75 years. Now we have Promenade Park, and we have a $100 million riverfront plan. It's going to be 1 mile on each side of the river. Going to be absolutely stunning, probably one of the best riverfronts in the United States. And of course, what happens then, you start to build housing around that, you start to get that amenity, then comes the retail and the restaurants, and all of a sudden you have a place that is as cool as any city you've ever been to.
Is it always restaurant-based? Is that the answer? You got to have 7 restaurants, and 2 of them are chains. You got to have a couple of bars. If Fort Wayne, you've got the Tin Caps, right? You have minor league baseball. You've got the Comets. You have minor league hockey. These things that have been institutions in Fort Wayne for years. Is that enough? Is that enough to drive and make people say, "Hot damn, I want to live in Fort Wayne"?
Well, I think you have to be continuously improving. So we have the zoo. We have baseball. We have the hockey, but we also now have places where people just go hang out with their friends. We have the Embassy Theater. We have the Clyde Theater, which is a stand-up music venue. So every year we add, kind of a new event. What that does is not just benefit Fort Wayne; it benefits Auburn, Angola, all the communities
and that's
around.
just it. How Fort Wayne is a big city. In Indiana, it is a big city. It is a known city. Auburn, less. Angola, less. How does your vision of running a state involve actual action plans to help a place like Auburn grow?
Yes. So when you go to these small towns, most of them are, when they're 10 to 15,000 in size, they have these beautiful downtowns that are historic. And when you look at their building stock, it's a lot. What we've seen kind of globally is about 80% of it is uninhabitable. So if you look at the second, third,
80% is uninhabitable. How?
Well, because they're not utilized right now. They
underutilized is different than uninhabitable.
Yeah, but they're virtually, if you walk through them, there's nobody in them, and they're not modern HVAC.
Oh, they're really dilapidated. They would
Yeah.
need to be tear downs to rebuild.
Not tear downs to rebuild, but they need to be restored.
Okay.
So what we're finding is these communities don't want to lose their historic buildings, that generally around their courthouse, right? Because you have 92 county seats and you have these beautiful historic buildings. But the second, third, and fourth stories are largely used for storage or something that, these could be turned into, housing. And we have a housing crisis all over the state of Indiana. And so what we're hoping to do with our Indiana Main Street initiative is to get the private sector engaged into restoring these buildings. And we have an example of that in places like Franklin, Valparaiso, and Van Wert, Ohio.
But doesn't usually that mean that some large entity, I'm not opposed to large entities, some large entity that has the capital, that has the financial wherewithal, gobbles it all up, and some guy who would like to buy 2 units with his brother-in-law and another friend and convert them himself and be able to start building a portfolio doesn't get a shot?
No, I think it's a both and. We've seen both happen. Like in Van Wert, as one example, the foundation bought 52 of their 100 buildings. They left them on the tax rolls, but then they were able to restore them with elevators and modern HVAC. But there's still plenty of buildings, another 48 buildings that are owned by individuals who also are excited that most of these buildings are going to get restored and fixed. So I don't think it's an either or model, but every community will be different. Every community will have a different approach to it. And we're excited to see what their approach is.
So in your view, you talk about this a lot, this Main Street initiative.
Yeah, Indiana Main Street, yeah.
Indiana Main Street. This isn't about a top-down methodology?
No.
Then give me the elevator pitch.
Well, so what has to happen when we restore these buildings, it's about $26 million to restore 10 buildings. So $10.6 million is what they're worth on an income basis when you're done. That means you have $15 million that you have to, because it costs the same, Tony, to build in a small town as it does in a big city.
Right.
But your rents are $1 a square foot versus $1.75 or $2 a square foot. So every building is priced on income, right? So when you finally get these buildings restored, they're really only worth $10.5 million. That's why they don't get restored top to bottom. So what we've done is been able to get new market tax credits and historic tax credits, which is a federal historic tax credit that gives you $5 million each, and then the state is in for $5 million, and that gets you, and then the private sector in for 10.6, and that begins to restore the buildings.
This is one of those conversations that leads itself into why in the world are the people of Indianapolis on the hook for Lucas Oil Stadium? Right? It tends to lend itself to this idea that you're making the argument that the state should be on the hook for what somebody in the private sector gets to profit off of, and that is a conversation of picking winners and losers. Describe to me how I'm wrong.
Okay, so let's look at what's happening now. Right now, for the last 50 years, our small towns have been losing. So we are just leveling the playing field, allowing them. The state is simply being a good partner. So the state spends $1 billion every year in economic development. Mm-hmm. We're simply saying that $100 million of that should go to small towns where 2.5 million people live.
Isn't the argument that the state should not be doing any of this, that we take a look at the IEDC and we take a look where money gets spent? We're not discussing whether or not people should be attracted to the state. We're not even discussing the idea of a tax credit because it's giving something that you haven't even gotten yet. They have to actually create the jobs, engage the business, do the thing, otherwise they don't get the benefit. But there is money that gets spent. We talk about LEAP, and I know you have thoughts on LEAP there in Lebanon. Is this the role of government? Is this fiscal responsibility in Indiana in a Doden governorship?
Yeah, I think it is. I think what you see is that we get a chance to have the private local leaders lead, and we partner with them to make it more of a level playing field where they have the ability to restore their towns and attract and retain their talent, their kids, and grow their economies. And what we know, Tony, right now is that over 55 of our counties are either neutral or negative in population growth. And it's really hard to have a growing economy when you can't grow your population.
The finest water Indiana has to offer is going to LEAP. We're taking water out of the Wabash and we're bringing it down to Lebanon, and we're telling the people of Lafayette, go blank yourselves. because we've got this project here and that is very important, because if we don't make Eli Lilly happy, well, then nobody's happy. So we have to go about doing this, and we're going to basically steal the land from the people of Lebanon, from the people of the White Sun area, and they're not going to be able to say thing one about it, and then we're going to say, isn't this great? That is how the LEAP district ended up unfolding to the vast amount of Hoosiers. Describe what LEAP is, and to the extent you have an issue with it, what is your issue?
Yeah, so I came out a few months ago and said I have deep concerns about the LEAP district, and one of the things that the IDC is doing now is acting like a private developer. They're taking taxpayer money and they're buying. They have, at least under option, it sounds like 10,000 acres at a very high price, 70 to 100,000. So do that math, Tony. That's roughly $1 billion if they buy all that land. The impact that has on the surrounding community is you have farmers that have been farming. Let's say they have 4,000 acres that they farm. They might own 500 acres. But they're renting. They call it renting the other 3,500 acres, right? So now they were going to buy that. Well, now because and this is what they've told me, and they're deeply concerned about, and I understand their argument. The inflation of the price of their land has gone to where they now can't buy it. They might have been renting this land for 10, 20, 30 years, and they're using taxpayer dollars to drive up the price of the land. So that's one thing.
Right. So the other thing is what?
Well, then beyond that, what I started hearing is that there was a $2 to $3 billion water problem, right? And that they were going to start taking water from a smaller community down to a larger community. And I really at first, Tony, had a hard time believing this was true, but then as it unfolded, it was exactly what was going on. And then I started talking with other experts, and they were saying, well, look, the utilities are going to be more than the water. So now you're talking about a $2 to $3 billion utility challenge to get utilities there. And then the third component of it was that we don't have enough energy to service some of the things that, they're talking about, maybe a chip plant or, well, these are what we call energy hogs, and they just suck a lot of energy out of the system. The net effect of that is because our energy production is the same as our usage, we now have to go buy energy from other states at a much higher price, which will drive up the energy cost for everybody in the state of Indiana. So you're talking about, billions of dollars being spent on one county when we believe that we really should have a 92 county strategy, and that the IDC should not be acting like a developer.
Is this not an argument against putting money into the development of small towns? This is the government, the state of Indiana said this is a winner. This is the kind of project that you hang your hat on and you say, look at us, America. Why in the world would you go to Texas? You freaks. Only come to Indiana. Every place else sucks. Look what we can do. If you were to ask Governor Holcomb, I would bet you dollars to donuts that's his argument. That's the argument of the IEDC. And that might be the argument of Brad Chambers, who's also running in this race for governor. But if it's wrong for government to get involved in that, why would it be okay to government get involved in building out buildings around town squares in all 92 counties?
Well, there's some big differences, Tony. One is we're not advocating that government go in and buy the buildings. There's a big difference between what's happening at the LEAP when they're buying the land and acting like a developer. The other thing, like we've seen with regional cities, for example, when there's some expenses that are hard to cover in the private sector, like environmental issues, soil issues, buildings that have been run down for 30 or 40 years. And so this program is really taking the power back to the local leaders and saying, how do you want us to partner with you? So if you want to restore 20 buildings and you're willing to bring 10.6 or $20 million to do that, we want to just be a good partner to you, and here's what we'll do to help you get this job done. That's really different from the top-down approach of LEAP. And really READY, the reason I go back to regional cities is because READY, when we put the money in for READY.
Define READY, R-E-A-D-I.
Yeah, R-E-A-D-I. It's a program that, regional economic development program, in which they then, each region gets a certain amount of money. But the IDC is deciding, which projects to do. What we did under regional cities is that the local RDA board, a group of local leaders, decided what was the highest and best use of that economic development money. And so, these are very different programs and very different ways of of doing economic development and making sure that everybody, all 92 counties, have a shot to grow.
You're governor, day one. LEAP still a thing?
Well, not in the way it is today.
What changes?
Well, they're obviously building,
Right.
Some things. So, that's going to be built. I think, we're not going to conduct ourselves as a developer. So we're going to, we're going to let the land that's under contract, lapse. And I think what we're going to do is focus on making sure that we go back to the model where we serve, the people, but we're not acting like a developer.
But it's okay if a city acts like a developer. I just want to make sure I'm understanding the through line of a thought process, and I'll give you an example. The city of Indianapolis decided to pass bonds to build a hotel. The Signia Hotel, they decided they weren't going to go through. It was their Pan Am Plaza, and all of a sudden the city said, "Don't worry, we'll do it. We got the bond measure. We'll build it." The city of Indianapolis that can't fill a pothole is unless an All-Star game is in town. They're going to build a hotel. That's irrational. That okay by you as governor?
No, that is not the way that I think it should be done, and I was pretty clear on that. This is the private sector. Usually local businesses that are coming together in either a partnership or with a group, and in this case, in some cases they're coming together as a foundation because they kind of view this as forever buildings. Mm-hmm. So they want to make sure, because a lot of these communities, about 20% of their building stock is owned by people outside the community, and they're not taking care of it. So if they can buy the local leaders through the private sector, not government, mm-hmm. can buy the buildings and restore them, then they can make sure that these buildings are taken care of. And I think that's the key, Tony. It's not, I don't think city government, county government, or state government should be buying buildings. This is private sector driven with local leaders in the private sector doing the partnership and saying we want to make sure our community is thriving over the next 25, 50, 75 years.
One of the subjects in the news is social services, Family Social Services Administration, FSSA. I think I'm saying it right, Family Social Services Administration. And there's news that there's a $1 billion shortfall. Now, this is $1 billion not in actual cash, but in budgeting. And I think that is an important note. But one of the ways the state has discussed fixing this shortfall is by changing the way that parents get paid. In a way of explanation, if you have a child that has an issue, instead of hiring a caretaker, the state has a system by which the parent can get paid for being the caretaker. You can agree or disagree with the idea of it. It's certainly an interesting idea. What the state said is they want to change the way that funding mechanism worked. So it would take away a certain level of direct payment. It would change where the dollar came from, and they believe they'll have a $300 million savings. A two-parter here. Describe how you get to $1 billion shortfall, and did the state, which is a way of saying the Republican Party, have they handled this correctly?
Well, first of all, Tony, let's start with the big picture. I think this is really important to me and a deep passion of mine that we protect the vulnerable. And in this case, you have families and kids that are vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to take away some of that benefit, you're really putting families at risk and kids at risk. And so I think we want to be very careful as we navigate this issue that we protect the vulnerable. That's going to be a really important part to me of what we do. It's what you do as a leader. If what good is it to have great economic development if you don't protect the vulnerable? Okay. That's important, right? In this case, that shortfall, as I understand it from industry leaders who are trying to educate all of us on this, is a projected shortfall.
Correct.
So it's not an actual yet shortfall, and it's projected based on extrapolating percentages and what could happen. And so I think that one of the arguments being made by some of the people that want to protect, and I think it's a reasonable argument, is let's just put a cap on the amount. Like let's say the cap is $75 million. And right now, I think the budget is, $55 million. I'm kind of using numbers that may not be completely accurate.
You're giving a theory. I can deal with that.
And so if you put a cap on it, then you still can protect the vulnerable, but you also don't have the potential shortfall. And so there's some really, I think, creative ideas out there. But I think going back to the big picture, our goal as a state government should be to protect the vulnerable and then make sure that we have a responsible budget. but also not necessarily use, extrapolations that may not be accurate. We got to be careful there.
So, but this has become a massive discussion point that how do Republicans explain away $1 billion? You're the governor overseeing a General Assembly that just told you there's $1 billion shortfall, and now you're going to have to tell a mom who cares for her child who has X, Y, or Z issue, you no longer get paid. As a matter of just sheer politics, that is a garbage position to be in and a very, very hard one to explain away. You're the governor in this. What's your take? What's your maneuver?
Yeah, so one of the things I've said from day one, I'm the only candidate that said that every agency head will have to reapply for their job. So we know there's a lot of improvement right now that needs to happen in the agencies, and we're going to make sure that we have the best talent possible, and that anyone that knows me knows that I am big into relationships, but I'm also big into accountability. Like, there will be accountability with the agency heads to make sure that they serve the people of Indiana well and do their job well. So that's going to be a big part of the overarching, what we're going to do across the 25 to 30 agencies that we get to put people in place. Because that is one of the things the governor gets to do, is to appoint and hire these agency heads.
The accountability conversation is a good one. In the state of Indiana, the Republicans have a supermajority, and they've had a supermajority for as long as I've been here. And I can tell you, as a guy who sits on the political right, I have not seen it utilized in a way that makes me say, that's how you use a supermajority. As a matter of fact, I would argue that the supermajority in the state of Indiana doesn't go anywhere near some of the subjects that it needs to. And I have made the argument that that has to do with a governor who doesn't lead them in a direction. Is the Republican Party accountable for not spearheading more bold visions? Or is this a function of not having a leader in the governor's mansion who is looking for a more bold future?
Well, I'm not here to litigate the past, Tony. You know I'm not going to do that. But I'm also here to say this. Under my leadership, we will have a bold vision. And we have room for improvement. We've done a lot of good things, but now, you can never be satisfied in life with the past. You always have to look at what can we improve in the future. And I think as a leader, one of the most important things you do, especially as the governor, is set the tone every day for what we expect to improve, how we expect to improve it, how you hold your agency as accountable, how you solve problems, how you negotiate with the General Assembly, and the tone you set. And I will tell you that my friends in the General Assembly have said, we're excited to have a bold, visionary leader because we need a bold, visionary leader.
Which would make me say, how come none of them engage in a level of bold, visionary leadership? Why, what's the point of the supermajority if none of them stand up and say, here's an idea, let's go with that? So let's go back to this FSSA conversation. If I could talk, I would be a great radio professional. $1 billion shortfall, and nobody said, here's the problem. $1 billion shortfall, and the answer is change the way people get paid. Is that, to you, a bold, visionary step?
No, I think there's something in the middle, is what I've just articulated. We don't have to eliminate all of the benefits to these families. And at the same time, we can make sure that we don't let this thing just go into $1 billion, that there's a shortfall of $1 billion, right? So I think there's, it looks like to me there's some creative things that we can do that you have to obviously work through the General Assembly to do if there's going to be legislation passed, but that it's not binary. We don't have to do, it's not either or. It's, let's be strategic and thoughtful about and make sure we protect these kids and these families.
In the same vein of a conversation, let's talk about property taxes, which became a huge issue this past year as people looked at their property tax bill and said, when did I move to Illinois? Are we in Jersey? What has happened? There's not even good pizza. What? There's some good pizza. Let's not kid ourselves. The property tax issue has become a sticking point. And for me, personally, the idea that I have to pay taxes on something I already own, otherwise it could be taken from me by the state, is reprehensible. The very concept of property taxes means I don't actually own what it is that I own. In your administration, will we see the ability for seniors, people on a fixed income, who have paid their property taxes, or maybe who have just moved here, will they get a chance? Will we be able to say to them, we're going to forego your property taxes? You do not, you've contributed enough. Thank you so much. Good night. Is there a way of reducing the property tax burden on homeowners across the state?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things that we've thrown out as ideas that I think are worth considering. You know, one is this issue, again, protecting the vulnerable includes our seniors who are on a fixed income. So let's say that they're paying $1,000 in taxes, and then they wake up and the next year they have to pay $1,300. Well, they're on a fixed income. They need predictability. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we're looking at and proposing is that when you turn a certain age, let's say 70, that your property taxes then are fixed until you sell the property or until there's, you know, a liquidity event, which generally means that, you know, there's, you know, you've passed. But, you know, you have $1,000 is fixed for, let's say you own that home for another 20 years, it's fixed so that you have surety as to what your property tax is going to be. And then when the house is sold, maybe 20 years later, there's a true-up. You could have a true-up system. But right now, the way the system works is these property taxes are funding local government. And the General Assembly is studying like different, you know, taxing methodologies because they get to pass the statute that dictates the taxing, whether it's sales tax or income tax or property tax. And so we're going to see like what they want to modify and change. But in the meantime, let's protect, you know, our elderly and make sure that they have surety. Right. And then another thing that I think has come up with a lot of people I've talked to is, you know, 15, 20, 30% increase in property taxes because of the assessed value.
Right.
So we do have a 1, 2, 3. You know, your house is capped at 1%. You know, property tax. But what we want to do is kind of like no surprise rule. So what about having a cap on how much it can grow in any given year? So let's say if it's $1,000, the max it can grow is 10%. And that way, at least you know that the most it could go up is 10%. It can't go up 30% or 40%.
But you brought up the idea of a true-up. Hold people firm at a number, and then at a liquidity event, sell. There would be a true-up. Can't the state just do without those dollars?
Well, it's not the state that gets those dollars. On property taxes, that's funding local government.
Sure enough.
And so that's what we got to be careful of, is that if we're going to take away property taxes from local government, you have to replace that tax with something. And so the state government doesn't get that tax.
He's right. That's how you do it. You say somebody's right when they're right. Is education a government good, or is education a consumable product?
Is education a government good?
Or is education a consumable product?
A consumable product. Well, here's how I view it. So I'm going to not answer your question in this way. Education, like, hey, at least I admitted it. Education is enshrined in our Constitution. I think it's not only a pragmatic imperative, it's a moral imperative to educate your kids. And so, we have a moral and pragmatic imperative to educate our kids. And it's enshrined in our Constitution. And so what I'm excited about is, attracting and retaining really talented teachers. That's why we have a teacher investment program. That we have a teacher shortage right now, by the way. So we have, especially in small towns and rural communities, they have a shortage of teachers. A lot of teachers, there's a supply-demand imbalance, as we know, on labor. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these teachers are able to make a lot more money in other industries. So we want to try to do the best we can to attract and retain that talent. But we also know that our kids' success, a lot of it is based on how well they're educated, especially in that 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old range.
Are kids well educated in a public education system?
Well, that's why I like competition, Tony. That's why I'm a big fan of parents having the right to choose where their kids go to school. Mm-hmm. Because even in the public schools, the administrators have admitted to me that the competition between private and charter schools has made them better and has made them more aware of how they need to improve. But
the union wouldn't agree to this. Well, teachers' unions are, you talk about attracting teachers, you talk about teacher pay, but teacher pay is never connected in a union conversation to teacher output, which is to say the skill set. I've made the argument that I'm willing to have the state of Indiana pay the teachers the most in the country if we're allowed to get rid of the bad teachers, which would have to is predicated on the idea that we admit that maybe there are bad teachers. There are people who are not good at all sorts of things. Maybe they have a different skill set. How do you go about paying the teachers and ensure you have quality if unions are not interested in the quality conversation? And do you believe that unions are not interested in the quality conversation?
Well, I think that's going to be a tough conversation we're going to have with the union. Like, you know, there needs to be accountability and quality, but this is what I like, Tony, about the parents getting more and more engaged in the education of their kids. There's far more accountability now, especially what happened is, parents started seeing how their kids were being taught during COVID. And it opened up a lot of eyeballs as to some of the things that were going on. So now you're seeing a lot more parent involvement in the school boards, a lot more parent involvement in the teachers, the meetings with the teachers and that type of thing. So I think that's all positive. I think it's what's needed. A lot of these are local issues. In my neck of the woods, the teachers that I deal with, are very gifted people, very dedicated to the kids. A lot of them go to my church, and they're not teaching inappropriate things, but they're also wearing out. Because they'll say, like, I have 25 kids, 23 of the 25 are doing great, but those 2 are so disruptive that I'm having a hard time teaching my kids. And because of No Child Left Behind, even if you take the 2 kids that are disruptive out, they'll put them right back into the school, into the class within 10 or 15 minutes. And that creates an environment where these teachers are really struggling to teach kids. And they're feeling, they've said this, they feel more like social workers than teachers. So I think this, the breakdown of the family, strengthening the family is going to be important. I think that's why, strengthening
the governor has a role in strengthening the family?
Well, I think, as leaders, we have a role in strengthening the family. It's not just the governor. The governor is just one leader. And I'm not going to strengthen 7 million people by myself. This has got to be a team effort with church leaders, education leaders, local government leaders, 501c3 leaders who deal with a lot of these families. And then you have business leaders. And by the way, a lot of people go to work every day. So there's a role to play for leadership across the board.
You show up to the State House, you're the governor, and there are 12,000 teachers, and I don't know whatever the color is that day, it's red or it's whatever it is, screaming that you hate teachers, you're destroying public education, you're the enemy. You now have a chance to address them because you actually believe that teachers should be held accountable and that the union should not be able to keep bad teachers on the rolls. What do you say?
Well, we say that we value teachers, but we also should be open to accountability. We also should be open to getting better. That's what we do. That's who we should be. This is about the kids, and it should be about the kids. Leadership is about serving others, and it's about adding value to their lives. And that's what we should be doing, and that's what we should be focused on.
Let's discuss you. In the realm here, there are actually 6 Republican candidates who have filed for governor. And everyone's got their own story. And then there are stories about them. Let me give you the story about you in case you didn't know this. No one knows who you are, sir. You're a nice guy. Literally no one has any idea who Eric Doden is. Outside of Fort Wayne, no one. You've got a primary on May 7th. How do you overcome that?
Well, first of all, I mean, we've been on the road 2.5 years and have been in every county multiple times. In fact, most counties we've been in 5 or 10 times. So I would say over the last 3 years, we've gotten to know a lot of people. That doesn't always show up in polls, as you know. It's grassroots and grassroots driven. I also know this, when I go to a small town, Tony, because I grew up in a small town, when you talk to 10 or 20 or 30 people in a small town, which we've done many times, the whole town is aware of who you are. That's the way small towns work.
Right.
So I would say that nobody knowing me is probably an overstatement, to say the least, especially around the state when we've traveled for nearly 3 years now. Now, I said beyond that, as you know, that we're getting our message out through media, social media, and they're seeing my background, where my grandfather was a preacher for 40 years in Indiana. They're seeing the values that are important to me. Faith without works is dead, and without vision people perish. They're seeing that we're about.
Say that part again, a little slower.
So faith without works is dead. That's something my grandpa taught me from, if you put your faith to work. Don't just talk about your faith, but do something, right? And then without vision, people perish. We've always been taught wherever we're at to have a bold vision, either for our lives, but also for the lives of others and serving others, right? So it's a lot about serving and putting your faith to work. And so those are important things to me. They're hearing about our ideas like zero cost adoption, which has been very, very popular all over the state of Indiana. It's amazing how many people have either adopted or have been adopted, and they love this idea that we're gonna have a fund that would help not just pay for adoption, but the aftercare that can be very taxing on people financially. And so they also, the Indiana Main Street Initiative is very popular. There's a lot of cities that have felt forgotten, and they're like, you're the first person to talk about the importance of small towns in Indiana and in the United States. And we believe the 2.5 million people in those small towns, really do matter to the state of Indiana and its future. And so they also know me as a candidate with ideas. And so I think, what happens over the next 90 days as people become aware that there's a governor's race, because part of this is they're busy with their lives, they're doing their thing, but over the next 60 days, they're gonna really tune in to who's running. And I can just tell you, Tony, that everyone going to the polls will have the opportunity to know all of us candidates, every last one of them. And I do believe they'll make an informed decision on May 7th.
One of the things that's important to small towns is jobs. Jobs matter. There's a lot of discussion in the state of Indiana about jobs and going after the high-tech jobs and going after the coding jobs. You heard Governor Holcomb say in the State of the State that coding should be something that is mandatory in our schools and in the high school level. What are the jobs that Indiana needs?
Well, first of all, let's talk about jobs for a minute. When you talk to our current, people that employ people, our current, business owners, they're struggling to have enough people to grow their companies. And that creates a challenge, right? Because they want to grow their business, and in many cases their business is growing, but they can't get enough people to grow their business. So one thing we need to do is make sure that we attract and retain the talent that allows our current businesses to grow. The other thing that we know, Tony, from studying this is that small startup businesses and the small businesses really drive your economy. Not the large companies. Those get the headlines, but what really drives your economy is those small and medium-sized businesses.
How many employees in a small business?
Oh, 5, 10, 20, 30. But again, they don't drive headlines.
Right.
Like if a small business opens up with 5 people making $100,000 a year, that doesn't necessarily drive a headline. But if you land a factory with 2,000 workers at 45,000 or 50,000 a year, that grabs a headline. So what we want to do is create this environment in the state of Indiana where the economy decides what the next jobs of Indiana are going to be through the startups and the kind of businesses that are started. That's why it's so important to get the talent to move back to Indiana.
Are there wrong jobs for Indiana?
Well, I think all work is honorable work. And sometimes when people don't have a gainful employment job, that's what leads to some of the mental health issues and depression that people experience because they don't feel that they have meaningful work in their life. And so I really hesitate to talk about jobs being wrong.
Right.
I think it's more about, let the market decide what jobs that we're going to create. Let the people decide who are bringing their ingenuity and innovation decide. And then let's do the best we can to make sure that people have a community they're proud of and meaningful work that gives them dignity.
You're Governor Eric Doden. You're sitting there in the mansion. You're like, this place is pretty cool. Describe to me the action plan of the first 100 days of the Doden administration.
Yeah, so the action plan is, number one, we're obviously going to be in a budget session, right? So you start on January 13th, 14th, or 15th, whenever you get sworn in. The General Assembly's already been in session, and they've already proffered a budget. So you have to get busy with the budget. Obviously, I've made it clear that we're going to have a $100 million out of $1 billion for our small towns. So we're going to focus on making sure that our small towns have, the Indiana Main Street Fund available to them. We're going to make sure that we do the best we can to have an initial funding of zero cost adoption, and then, have a tax credit, kind of like we do SGOs, where, if you make a $1,000 donation to the adoption fund, you get a $500 tax credit on your taxes, and then the other $500 is tax deductible federally. So that $1,000 would cost you about $300. So we're going to get that set up and make sure that we have the zero cost adoption fund. And then we're going to start bringing the partners around the table that can help. Because one of the struggles in some of our communities is they don't have access to equity anymore. A lot of the businesses were sold to private equity. Well, those private equity firms, if you know anything about private equity, they'll take all the profits back to, the corporate mothership, we call it, and they'll never necessarily reinvest in a community. And so we have partners that we want to bring to the table that would help a community that is in that situation to have the private sector equity to be able to improve their community. And so that's going to be a part of it. We have 5 nonprofit hospitals that have over $30 billion on Wall Street, and we feel that about 30% of that should come back into an Indiana Main Street Fund and help communities grow, which by the way will benefit the hospitals because it means we'll grow population. When you grow population, the hospitals get more business. So these are the kind of things that we're going to focus on. And then, what happens after the budget session is you get to go back on the road, really a lot, spend a lot of time on the road. And you can do some of that during the budget session, but you heavily can then begin to visit communities and meet with leaders and partner with them on things that are important to them. And a lot of what a leader does is listen, Tony, and you got to go out and listen. You can't ask them to come, to the governor's mansion or to the state house. You got to go out where they're at, be with them in their hometown, in their place, and then listen to what it is they're dealing with, and then figuring out how you can serve them best and partner with them.
What is the move you would make, the biggest move you would make on economic growth in the state?
Well, I think the biggest move we're going to make is empowering a 92 county strategy where everyone gets a chance to be successful. We have to make sure that we don't have 55 counties neutral or declining in population. That's not a long-term benefit to the state of Indiana. Kind of what's happened is our small communities have given to our bigger cities. Our bigger cities give to Indy, and Indy gives to Denver, Nashville, and Austin.
Right.
And so we got to stop that trend and start, re-engaging our talent and kids and grandkids to move back to, their home communities. And I'm really confident and hopeful that over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll start to really see a lot of positive movement in that direction.
What is the most unpopular thing you're going to do as governor?
Well, I think whenever you hold people accountable to results, especially agency heads, and that could make some people very uncomfortable in government who have used to kind of doing it their way and being very bureaucratic. And now there's going to be a lot more accountability. Accountability, look, if you like your fitness instructor, you probably should get a new one, right? Because your fitness instructor is out there to make you get better and to, get more fit, it's not a popularity contest there, right? So I think there's a lot of what you do in leadership is when you hold people accountable and you bring discipline and structure and accountability, that's gonna make some people upset.
Which agency needs to be held most accountable on day one?
Well, I definitely think that we need, kind of a reset on the IDC. I think that Child and Protective Services, DCS, and then I think there's a few others that we need to really understand, what they're doing more and have more accountability there. But those two in particular, they impact so many families, especially DCS.
We talked about the idea of supermajority and where the Republicans are. The other side, there are Democrats. They are there in the House and they are there in the Senate. How are you working with them?
Well, I think the first thing you do is you meet with them. In fact, the zero cost adoption policy came from somebody who was a Democrat that challenged me that while I was pro-life and ardently pro-life, she didn't think I was pro-mother and pro-family. And she challenged me with that. And my initial reaction was to be a bit defensive. I think anytime that we're kind of attacked, we tend to get defensive inside, right? But I really just felt in my spirit that it was time for me to just listen and reflect. And as I reflected on what she said, that's when the idea of zero cost adoption came up, and I'm like, here's how we can show that we're not just pro-life ardently, but that we're pro-mother, pro-child, pro-family, and we can make an adoption and getting kids in loving homes as fast as possible something that we deeply support and empower families to love on these kids.
The message that you want people to take away after they meet you, after they've gone to your website, after they've watched this video, what is the message you want Hoosiers to take away with them and bring to the polls on May 7th?
Well, I actually have a request for Hoosiers, who are going to vote. Number one, let's hold us accountable to have a bold vision as leaders for the state of Indiana, in writing. Like we're the only candidate that has a plan in writing that we can be held accountable to. If you're supporting somebody else, ask them to do the same. There ought to be accountability for us as well that they're holding us accountable to. The other thing I've been asking Hoosiers all over the state of Indiana is to roll up your sleeves and put your faith to work, because this will take a team effort. One person is not going to change the lives of 7 million people, Tony. We're human. We're going to do the best we can, but this is going to take a team effort, and so roll up your sleeves and put your faith to work. And then the third thing I've asked them is to have a bold vision for their community, and one that should make you uncomfortable. We announced our bold vision for Fort Wayne as a business community. It was a $650 million plan that we do in 10 years. This was a business community announcing this plan. We announced it in the press on purpose so that there'd be accountability. And we put that on the front page of the paper and Wayne TV. Now, they thought we were crazy, but when we got $400 million of deals done in 3 years, that accountability drove our behavior to get things done. And so I think having a bold vision, and then the last thing I'm asking people to do is to pray, for every candidate that's in this race, pray for safety, for wisdom, and for a servant's heart, because we're on the road a lot. There's, you've seen, we've seen, unfortunate tragedies happen, and then we also, when you're in this sort of bubble, there's a lot of wisdom that you need, and there's also when you gain power, you really have to make sure that you have a servant's heart and that it doesn't go to your head. So those are things that we ask people to pray for us on, and pray for all the candidates, regardless of who wins. And then the last thing I'll say is, whoever wins this election, because we cannot predict what 800,000 to 1 million people will do. Macy and I are committed to supporting and being involved and engaged. We're in our early 50s, so this is a 25-year journey for us, and we're committed to supporting and being a part of that team going forwards.
We are doing these videos with all of the candidates running on the Republican side for governor in the state of Indiana. You can find everything at WIBC.com. All the videos will be there. Cuts of this will be throughout your social media feeds, and of course, audio will be playing not only on my shows, but throughout WIBC.com, and I'm going to make the assumption of Network Indiana. You've got questions, reach out to the candidate yourself. Of course, you'll have links to Eric Doden and all of the candidate sites below each video, so you can find out more about them and what it is they're doing. Appreciate you watching. Don't forget to check out the other videos and find everything at WIBC.com. I'm Tony Katz.
Thank you, Tony.
That's it, sir. Well done.